In the United States, the government has consistently been restrained by the Supreme Court from censoring hate speech all across the ideological spectrum of justices. This is a deeply entrenched principle. Government may never discriminate against speech because of dislike, even loathing of its viewpoint. But for all practical purposes, most of the conversation today is taking place on social media. Now, you take that undeniable fact and couple it with the legal point, which I totally agree with Floyd and Ellen is correct, that these companies are not subject to the First Amendment themselves. To the contrary, they have their own First Amendment rights. So here we have the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, giant private companies exercising more censorial power than any government ever has, but not constrained by the Constitution. I do oppose straightforward government regulation, but when you look at what has evolved with those companies, that they started with a much more free speech friendly approach, but because there has been so much pressure on them to crack down on hate speech, disinformation, extremist content, terrorist content, those are usually the objects of controversy, there hasn't been enough counter pressure that we really want to have more free speech, less dominance by the platforms in terms of making editorial decisions that are at best arbitrary and capricious, and at worst outright discriminatory.
All of us have a job to do. We have to create a free speech culture in this country because it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. It does not exist. You know, when I used to teach my classes in college and law school, I would ask students, how many of you believe in free speech? Every hand goes up. Mm-hmm. Then I'd start with a list of exceptions. Mm-hmm. How many would ban the N-word? Hands. How many of you would ban Holocaust denial? Hands. How many of you, and then I go up. By the end of the class, nobody was in favor. Everybody had an exception. And so the myth that we are a country that believes in the culture of free speech, and I'm so glad, Nadine, you introduced that concept today, in the culture of free speech is a myth. Free speech is a tactic. And I think people today on the hard left are writing about that. There are academics who are writing about it, saying free speech is a tactic. It's paternalistic, it's patriarchal, it's colonial, it's all of those things. We don't need free speech. It helps white privilege, all of that. They have a point. They have a point in the sense that free speech has been used widely as a tactic by the right against the left, by the left against the right. But the people who actually would literally die or come close to dying to defend views that they disagree with are always few and far between in any culture.
Some of it doesn't bother me. Some of it that would violate the First Amendment, if this were the government, is what I view as editorial judgments of the sort that we would not blame any newspaper for making. Well, take Nazi speech, for example. Take false speech about health issues, for example. Seems to me perfectly appropriate for social media entities to make their own decisions about whether they want their product, so to speak, to be contaminated with that sort of expression. And so, and I certainly would have no problem with Facebook affirming that they are not 100% First Amendment guided. That is to say, that they would not take a full page swastika, even though the government couldn't ban it, and that they would not allow certain views to be expressed. Now that has its dangers, which are obvious, and that they are all the same dangers, or many of them, that all of us agree leads to our affirming broad First Amendment protection in these areas.
Then how do you, on the one hand, adopt your position, and then how do you deal with the dangers? from your perspective,
Make choices.
how?
There are dangers in certain speech does have dangers. The question for a private entity is to assess those dangers unless the private entity chooses to be bound by pure First Amendment standards. I polled a class of mine at Yale Law School not long ago after a full class in which we were talking about social media. And my final question to them was, how many of you would want Facebook to be First Amendment ruled, internally decided, of course, but all the same standards, which is to say allowing basically anything goes, and hardly any of them were. And that's not, in my view, cancel culture. That seems to me an entirely appropriate and even wise decision.